or second category of damages are punitive damages. These damages really have nothing to do with making the plaintiff whole. They are instead designed to deter wrongful conduct by either the defendant or anyone similarly situated. They're punishment damages. Just as a court of criminal law issues a fine or sends somebody to prison, civil courts can issue monetary damages designed to deter wrongful conduct, both by the entity, the company or the person who engaged in the wrongful conduct in this particular case, as well as by anybody else out there who might have the opportunity to refrain from the same kind of conduct. It's very difficult to get punitive damages in Texas. In fact, I often tell people, if you're in the state of Texas, we're a pretty conservative state now, you have to understand, judge-wise, in most areas of the state, and our Court of Criminal Appeals and our Supreme Court I think they're all conservative judges. They're all from the Republican Party, and they generally are pretty conservative. In Texas, unlike many states, we have two high courts. We have a high court that hears civil matters. That's the final court to decide civil matters, and that's called our Supreme Court. And then we have a final court to hear criminal matters, which is called the Court of Criminal Appeals. And both of those are as I understand it, as I recall, have only Republicans right now, and they're very conservative judges. I don't know of any case, I'm trying to think of one, and there may be one, and somebody may correct me by calling our offices, but I don't recall really any case where the Texas Supreme Court has approved an award of punitive damages in any case that didn't involve intentional wrongful conduct in many, many years. There have been cases where a chemical company, I remember in one case, there was an explosion that occurred in a certain part of the plant, and they had been warned repeatedly about this potential for this explosion, and it had already occurred, and it had already caused injuries, and they still let it continue and didn't fix it, and the court still said that wasn't enough to warrant punitive damages. So it's very difficult to get punitive damages in any case in Texas unless somebody set out to engage in wrongful conduct. An exception might be things like drunk driving, but it's very difficult to get these kinds of damages. The standard is reckless disregard for the rights of others or gross negligence. If you engage in gross negligence, you may be subject to punitive damages. Gross negligence is more than momentary thoughtlessness, inadvertence, or error of judgment. It means such an entire want of care as to establish that the act or omission was the result of actual conscious indifference to the right, safety, or welfare of the person affected. A lot of words here again in small print. All you have to know from that is that to recover punitive damages in the state of Texas, you have to prove that the defendant engaged in an act, knew the risks of that act, knew that he could injure or hurt people, and did it anyway without regard for that. There are other requirements on punitive damages as well. The defendant may only be punished for the conduct that caused injury. And this is significant because in the past what some people would do is they would say, well, here's this defendant who allowed this harmful condition to exist on their property, and the defendant's also a real bad person. For instance, let's say that you have a homeowner, and the homeowner invites people over to his home and leaves a dangerous condition on the home. Maybe there's a hole, and the homeowner, because it's an unsightly hole, an ugly hole, covers it with twigs and branches, and some child walks into the hole and gets seriously injured. And then you go out and you have a trial and you say, okay, we should get punitive damages because this guy also beats his dogs. And he also yells at his wife and he curses at his neighbors. You can't get punitive damages by showing that the person is just a bad person in general. You can only get punitive damages for the particular conduct that caused injury. And it'd be very difficult to show that cursing at his wife had anything to do with him leaving the hole out there in his yard and just covering it up to disguise it. There are some instances where the general mindset of the defendant may be relevant to establish whether or not the defendant's mindset when the defendant engaged in the particular wrongful conduct that caused injury was an entire want of care or an entire disregard for the rights of others. But those instances will be difficult to prove. There must be a reasonable relationship to compensatory damages and punitive damages. This all started in a case in Alabama where an automobile dealer had claimed that it was I can't remember exactly what happened. I think the dealer claimed that it was fixing a car or that it was replacing a car, and instead it just painted over the car. And the jury got so angry it awarded $100 million in punitive damages. So they awarded a few $1,000s to fix the car or replace the car, and then $100 million in punitive damages. And the court, it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, look, we're not going to give a bright line test for what the limit is on punitive damages, but we are going to say that they must bear some reasonable relationship to the amount of compensatory damages. You can't go into court and say, all right, I bought this steak dinner, and the steak dinner cost me $20, and it was horrible and disgusting, and I hated it, and they knew everybody hated it, and they knew it was inferior steak, and they put it in there anyway, I want $1 million. You can't do that. There has to be a relationship between the amount of compensatories and the amount of punitives. Some states have damages capped at a multiplier. In the state of Texas, in certain cases, we have multipliers where you can only get punitive damages. I think the standard, the last time I checked, and please don't hold me to this, was that it'd be $200,000 or 2 times, maybe it's 3, but I believe it was 2 times actual damages, compensatory damages, whichever is greater. So there are limits in most states on the amount of punitive damages that can actually be awarded. But in the end, punitive damages are designed to deter wrongful conduct from occurring in the future. And they're important because, as you can imagine, well, let's just take the McDonald's coffee case. One of the most controversial cases in recent jurisprudence is the case of the McDonald's coffee, where I believe the jury awarded something on the order of $7 million in punitive damages against McDonald's because of a coffee burn that a customer experienced. And people talk about how that was abuse of the system and we need tort reform and how terrible it was. What they don't know, and there's a great movie called, I think it's called Hot Coffee, that was made about this, a documentary, is that the woman who was injured in that, the person who was injured in that, I believe it was a woman, suffered 3rd-degree burns and had to have multiple skin grafts to correct her legs, and they're still not the way they should be. And there had been about 50 other people who had been severely burned by McDonald's coffee in the past, and McDonald's actually had board of directors meetings where they discussed their coffee being too hot and burning all these people, and they decided that, hey, we make so much money off our coffee being better than other people's coffee because it's this hot that we'll just pay the damages and let the people get burned in order to sell the coffee, or something to that effect. Anyway, the facts were horrible, and it was disgusting conduct by McDonald's that led to that verdict. And that sometimes gets glossed over when people look at that. But in any event, if you can see that just awarding somebody damages for the injury they suffered may not deter the defendant. Sometimes it could be 1/10 of 1% of 1 penny to the defendant. To you and me, that's what it would amount to. And so the defendant has to have higher damages awarded against it in order to deter it or prevent it and others from engaging in wrongful conduct in the future. The last thing I'll talk about are costs and attorney's fees. Let me distinguish costs and attorney's fees here from costs up here. What I mean, this actually should not, let me take this off. This is just costs and expenses. That was my mistake. Here, what I mean is the costs of litigation. You get reimbursed for how much it cost you to pursue the lawsuit. Over here, we're talking about the costs associated with your injury. So the medical expenses you need to correct the injury are a cost that you're awarded in compensatory damages. The amount of money it costs to fix your house, to repair your car, those would be costs you're awarded for in compensatory damages. Here we're talking about the cost of actually pursuing the lawsuit, how much it costs you to hold this defendant accountable. And you are generally reimbursed for your costs of suit. The cost of filing the lawsuit. You have to pay the court to file a lawsuit. The cost of having the defendant served with the lawsuit. You have to pay for that. The cost of a deposition. The cost of hiring an expert. The expert's time to analyze your case. Those are generally costs of court. Some of them are reimbursable. Some of them are not. Again, you can't go out and hire the best expert in the world and expect to be reimbursed for the cost of a Nobel Prize winner. Attorney's fees are awardable in some cases, but not others. And it's kind of complicated when they're awardable. Typically, they will be awarded in breach of contract cases, particularly if the contract says if there's any breaches, the winning party will get their attorney's fees. They are awarded in certain statutory cases where the cause of action or the claim is created by an act of the legislature, such as claims brought under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, the Insurance Code. Where the legislature adopts a law that creates the cause of action, it will also often provide that the winning party gets their attorney's fees. Sometimes it's the party who's awarded damages only, sometimes it's whoever wins. If the party who is accused of wrongdoing wins, they get their attorney's fees as well. And you can understand why attorney's fees might be awardable. Let's say you have a case in which some company sells tomato soup, and there's an ingredient in this tomato soup that they've used the cheapest ingredient in this tomato soup. They shouldn't have done it because it's an ingredient that creates nausea. And they knew it created nausea, but they did it anyway, and they did it because it was cheaper. They didn't tell anybody they were using that nausea ingredient in their tomato soup, and you get nauseated. Well, you can't go out and file a lawsuit against them. You really can't, because you would spend so much money doing it. The jury's never going to award as much money for a night of nausea as you would spend in several $100s filing fees and several $100s to have the defendant served, and you'd have to hire an expert who says this ingredient causes nausea, and the expert's going to charge you thousands of dollars. You're never going to get that back from a jury. So do we let people just all get exposed to this cheap ingredient that they lied about having in their product because nobody can afford to file a lawsuit because their damages, their injury isn't great enough to justify the expense? No, one of the ways we avoid that is by awarding attorney's fees. So there are cases in which you may have somebody who's awarded $200 or $300 in damages, but they get attorney's fees of millions of dollars. I can remember cases in the pharmaceutical litigation where it turned out that the person pursued a lawsuit against the drug company, and they couldn't prove that their particular injury was caused by the drug, but they could prove that the company lied about the drug. And I remember in one instance, the jury awarded everything to the plaintiff. They awarded them costs for their injury. They awarded millions of dollars for their injury, millions of all this money. And the Court of Appeals came back and said, we don't believe the plaintiff really had sufficient evidence to show that the drug caused their injury. But we do think the plaintiff showed that the drug was not what it was represented to be, that it didn't cure the condition it was being prescribed for, that the company knew that it didn't cure that condition, they knew that it was an ineffective drug, that it had no efficacy. And so what we will approve is return of the purchase price to the plaintiff. She gets the $25 she spent on that drug back, but she doesn't get the cost of her injury because we don't think she proved her injury was caused by the drug. But because pursuing the lawsuit for return of the purchase price, which is breach of contract, they sold a drug that was not what they contracted to provide, was what we call inextricably intertwined, meaning you couldn't separate them. You couldn't separate that claim, the claim for return of the purchase price, from the injury claim. We're going to award the plaintiff her $2.5 million in attorney's fees because she had to prove all the same things to prove the drug was ineffective that she would have to prove her injury claim. So in order to get the money back, the $25 she spent on the drug, she had to spend the same amount of money that she spent. So we're going to give her $25 in damages and $2.5 million in attorney's fees. There are rare instances where that does happen. But the bottom line is sometimes it's necessary to award attorney's fees to ensure that people will bring suit in cases where otherwise the damages may not be great enough to justify filing a suit. I hope this has provided you with a greater idea of the kinds of money damages that courts can award in lawsuits for various injuries. At a later time in subsequent programs, we'll talk about the other kinds of remedies like injunctive relief that the courts can also provide to the winning party.